Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our continuing video series in celebration of July Disability Pride Month and the anniversary of the signage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is Chris Nusbaum, project coordinator for the Bridges Technical Assistance Center. I think it was Ozzy Osbourne who might have coined the fan chant at rock concerts, "We're not worthy, we're not worthy." Well, that's a little bit how I feel today, because not only do we have with me our incomparable project director, Carlton and Cook Walker, but we have our guest, if Carlton isn't enough greatness for you, we have our guest who will both be interviewing together, and that is Dr. Sachin Dev Pavithran, the executive director of the U.S. Access Board, to talk with us about the impact of the ADA on employment, as well as anything else that might come up in this conversation. Sachin, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, Sachin, first of all, for those who are unfamiliar with you and unfamiliar with the Access Board, just what's your story? What does the Access Board do? Just give us the general overview.
I'm a blind immigrant. I immigrated to the US in 95 after high school. Prior to coming to the US, I did not have access to any kind of blinds related services, nothing through K through 12 growing up. I was born in India, grew up in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. K through 12 was done just because my mom read all my textbooks to me. So no blind related services whatsoever, no braille, no O&M training, nothing that you find here, which is very fortunate for students to have growing up here in the US. Unfortunately, I did not have any of that exposure. I was obviously fortunate to come to the US for higher education. My family was in a position to be able to send me here, but I came here as a blind person, really not knowing how I was going to do things independently. Fortunately, things worked out. I was able to find mentors along the way, find different ways to adapt and learn. Got introduced to the National Federation of the Blind, and things took shape over the years. But not having the kind of training of Braille or NM growing up really did create a lot of obstacles in my path through college, getting employment, and even currently, now being a fluent Braille reader is an obstacle for me. But I've been lucky enough to have the mentorship and role models in my life that kind of opened doors for me and helped me experience things in a way that I've been able to be successful as a blind person. I started as a computer programmer, worked a lot in this space of programming, got into the accessibility space, web accessibility, and also got very involved in grassroots advocacy through the NFB and other disability rights organizations. One of my good mentors pushed me really hard to get involved in broad spaces of advocacy on a national level, and then was fortunate to be appointed under President Obama, under the Obama administration, to work within the U.S. Access Board, but also play a key role in the White House in advising disability policy with the president. So things took shape because of opportunities that was in front of me and the opportunities that I seized. And now I am the executive director of the U.S. Access Board, and been able to do a lot of different things because of the different exposures I've had. The U.S. Access Board is an independent federal agency. We've been in existence for about 50 years now. It'll be 50 years this September. In 1968, Congress passed the Architecture Barriers Act, which was to make sure all federal spaces and federal facilities are accessible. But soon Congress came to realization just by having a piece of legislation and no standards and accessibility guidance, that law meant nothing. So we came into existence in 1973 under the Rehabilitation Act to write standards for under the Architecture Barriers Act to ensure federal spaces are accessible, but also to enforce that ABA. Soon after that, under other legislation such as the ADA, the Affordable Care Act, we've been given other authority to work on accessibility standards under public transit, built environment, information communication technology, all the different areas that we've been involved in. So that's who we are. We write standards. We are a regulatory agency. We don't enforce all the standards that we write, but our role is to write the standards and guidelines on the various aspects of accessibility.
Great. So I want to ask you, because you have such a unique perspective on this, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the ADA and employment. As an immigrant, what do you see as the differences or the changes as a blind person from a cultural perspective between your home country and the US, so that those of us who are natives can appreciate the cultural differences of our experience as blind people living here?
Indian culture generally is very interdependent, where family, extended family, all take care of each other. We work and function in a way so that everyone's, helping out each other. So, being a blind person, I've always had good family support, good support from, extended relatives. So I never felt that I wasn't included in anything, but it was very different when we think about independence. It's not me doing things on my own, it's me doing things with everyone else, where accommodation was needed, people stepped up and did things. I never felt like I was excluded, but I also never felt like I was doing things on my own. So it's interesting way of growing up where I never felt excluded for the most part, but I also didn't have the confidence to do things if my family or my close family friends were not around. Here in the US, independent living is a huge aspect. People do push for being independent, doing things on your own. It's a very different culture here, which I also think is equally important. I think interdependence is important and independence is important. So I think there's benefits of both way of doing things. I wish I had both, being independent growing up and also the interdependence with family and extended family. Also, I wouldn't give up what I had growing up, but I wish I had what students over here were experiencing when they're growing up, when they're exposed to quality K through 12 education and training and all those other things that people benefit by being a student in the US.
Interesting. And I could ask you a lot of questions about this, but so we're talking about the impact of the ADA on employment. So the ADA is passed in 1990. The Access Board has been around for a while, as you say, before then. And you come to the US in 95 after the ADA has been passed. What do you think the situation is since the ADA has passed in comparison to before it has passed, in terms of the job market and the ability of blind people to be able to have jobs and succeed in their jobs in the competitive workforce, say, for example, in what you were doing before you came to the Access Board in computer programming?
Let me take a step back. So, for me as an individual that did not grow up here in the US, when I came to the US, I thought US had everything that was, that a blind person needs. Obviously I realized, and again, I came in 95 after 88 passed. The more I got involved in different advocacy groups and the more I got exposure to different things in my personal life living in the US, I realized US has a long ways to go. Not because the things that I've missed, growing up in Dubai and India, it's because the potential the US has to be stronger when it comes to inclusion and accessibility and other things. So the ADA, although it got passed in 1990, coming in 95 and going through my college experience and starting work, there was still quite a bit of work to be done. And I think we have progressed quite a bit in the accessibility space, but accessibility is always evolving. And attitude is also evolving, but attitudinal barrier is probably our biggest challenge that we still face. And that's where employment gets a little tricky, because even though accessibility might have improved, even though it's not perfect, but attitudinal barrier still exists largely in sectors that are not used to seeing people with disabilities, especially blind people. We are seeing more blind people in non-typical blindness employment, like vocational rehabilitation or any kind of blindness training, the areas that you typically see blind people usually these days in employment. A lot of blind lawyers out there. But in the STEM space, it's lacking. And I think it's not because blind people can't do those jobs. I think there's still not enough challenge given to blind people to do that, but there's not a lot of organization or companies that are still prepared to take on a blind employee, mainly because they've never been exposed, nor they have been made aware of what blind people can do. I think it's shifting, but the shift is really slow. Hopefully that progresses a lot faster pace than it has. I know tech company has shifted. Some of the big tech giants have shifted, Microsoft being one, Apple and Google are coming along, but there's still a huge gap where blind people are not very common in a lot of those spaces.
So then looking ahead, knowing that you're in a position now to be pretty influential in making policy, what would you like to see in the future?
The role I play right now is obviously in the regulatory space, not in the employment space, but that doesn't mean I am at those tables where certain conversations do happen. So my hope and my desire is to expose those hard conversations that people don't have. Why are people with disabilities not at the table? And if industry is coming to the conversation and they want to have those hard conversations about accessibility, why don't they have people on their team that are blind or other disabled people who need to be at the table internally in their organization? Because no matter what these engineers and others say, if they don't have the lived experience, the industry that's trying to advance in some of these spaces that I work with are always going to be lagging behind because they don't have that personal experience. So my role would be pushing some of that dialogue along with the regulatory conversation that I have with industry, but also really challenging them to look internally as the organizational culture, what they can do to shift some of their practices, hiring and other things. Because I truly believe when organizations don't really make a cultural shift in the practices that they do, just thinking about accessibility doesn't happen magically. You got to own that shift within your organization.
Thank you so much, Sachin, Dr. Pavithran. This is Carlton Walker. Hi. I remember meeting you out back in Utah. Oh my goodness, more years ago than I would like to admit. But you were just studying then. You were, I think, newly a member of the Access Board and now executive director. My goodness. With regard to our stakeholders, where we serve the Maryland blind and low vision transition age students in 14 to 21, but we don't kick them out at 21 either. Their parents, their families, their educators, service providers, and community allies. What are some lived experience guidance would you give them? How to approach things that may be different from how you did, because of course you came from a completely different culture. In 2023, what kinds of things should they be looking at? What kinds of skills should they be thinking about in order to enter that workspace as confidently as possible and try to nudge the door a little open, even if it's not completely open, nudge it a little bit more?
I think the first thing I would push for, I think in K through 12, if the parents are involved in their IEPs and other, things that the students are going through, it is important for the parents to really help that student to also be an advocate and not just the parents talking for the students always.
Mm.
One thing for me, it was really the shift coming from, where I grew up to here to learn to advocate for myself was hard. It was not an easy thing for me to take on. I'm a fairly introvert, and for me to advocate on my own, it took some work within me to be able to do that. I think that's critical for all parents to really help their child, their student, learn how to advocate for themselves. Now, the parent can do that alongside so they can all do it together. But I think it's important for the student to also learn how to speak for themselves, advocate for themselves. Because once they leave that K through 12, the parents are not going to be tagging along. The parents are not going to be able to speak for them. The parent can't call, university professor and say, "What are you doing for my student?" No one will listen to you. And or if the student's going for an interview, you don't want to embarrass your kid.
Right.
It is important for the parent to play a significant role, but it's also important for the parent to let the student be able to stand on their own as well.
Yeah.
That's one I would say. I see that happen often, again and again, where the parent just would not let the student speak up or share their mind, whatever. Or and some students get very comfortable in that space where they just let the adults do the talking. I think that's a shift that really needs to be happening in IEPs, where students are not as open in those conversations. That's one thing I would say. The other piece I would say is, how can we help students relate and connect with, role models? Because it's one thing for the parents to expose them to different things going on, but it's very different when the student have a role model that they can really relate with. Just pairing someone with a role model or mentor sometimes doesn't pan out, and you can't just rely on one person.
Right.
The only reason I've been lucky to be exposed to a lot of different things and have the opportunities because I didn't have just one role model. I didn't just have one mentor. I had a lot of different mentors, and I eventually learned it's up to me to find those mentors. And when I come across that individual that I felt like would be a good role model or mentor, I didn't give them the choice. I basically said, "Oh, you're my mentor." So, and I kind of elevated their egos a little bit, making them think that they're very important. So, so it's something that you as an individual need to learn also how to kind of seize that opportunity where someone you might admire or respect, for whatever the reason might be, how they can help you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just one more question. You had mentioned the Architectural Barriers Act in 1968. And from my research, it definitely seems that, and not unreasonably so, the Access Board was really a mover and shaker in terms of architectural barriers. But I'm going to say physical architectural barriers because our world's changed so much, even before the pandemic. The architecture where a lot of us live is technological architecture, but I know that's not what they meant in 68. And I know that the Access Board is moving as quickly as they'll let you, regulators and Congress will let you, on reducing those barriers too. What are the most critical areas from your view as executive director of the U.S. Access Board that really need to be addressed either by Congress or in regulations or in agencies enforcing regulations or in industry doing the right thing? What are one or two things that you think are just monstrously needed?
Carlton, I think you're right. I think the built environment, the accessibility of the built environment architecture, those, for the most part, we have those figured out. I think that work has been done over the last many decades. And if you don't know how to build an accessible building, it's on you. Now, there's tweaks and improvements happening in some of those spaces on how an interesting design comes up, and we have to figure out how to do those accessibility parts, components into it. But for the most part, that has been addressed. The biggest barrier I see is the huge evolving information communication technology space, where it's constantly evolving, where you have all, if you just use the pandemic, the explosion of self-checkouts and kiosks and tablets being used in your daily retail or anything that you expose in the community, the access to everything that's going virtual right now. And I'm not talking just virtual meeting. I'm just talking everything is being shifted. The whole idea of conferences being in a virtual conference space. And there's so many different ideas being talked about, and it's evolving so fast that we can't even keep up with how accessibility would work in those spaces. I was talking to a group that wanted to have this accessible virtual conference, and the concept was just out of this world. Like, it's almost virtual reality kind of conference where you would walk in virtually and you are exposing yourself like you would go into any physical conference. How do you make that even? How would you even make that accessible? I just the conversation's not. I can't even figure out how to make that accessible because it's so visual,
Right.
and it's evolving a lot. This conversation about healthcare in the future, where your doctor is going to be probably not even the same country. Forget down the road. How are you going to be able to
How do we
have
make AI
conversations with your
accessible?
dog and have procedures done remotely?
Right. Yeah.
Those are the kind of conversations happening right now. Transit, autonomous vehicle, the huge shift. People keep saying it's not going to happen anytime soon in my lifetime. Well, it's happening. So,
Yeah.
what does that even mean for the blind population, the disabled population in general? So those are the shifting spaces that we're still struggling with. The problem being the barriers that we still have as a regulatory agency. There's so much we can do because we need authority given to us to work on certain things. We try to find ways to at least provide guidance where we can, but we can't, go beyond that till Congress gives us authority. So it's important for Congress to be informed so that they can give organizations or agencies like us the authority so that we're not coming into play too late when things are already in place and we can't, we're playing catch up like how we did after ADA was passed.
Right.
Dr. Pavithran, thank you so much. Very insightful, very wise, as we knew it would be, this conversation would be. And so thank you so much for sharing your insights and experience with us.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
That's Dr. Sachin Dev Pavithran, Executive Director of the U.S. Access Board. Find out more about the Access Board at access-board.gov. And if you need help with advocacy or finding your own voice in the IEP, as Dr. Pavithran so correctly pointed out, or anything like that, we can help with those things and many more. Contact us at helpdesk@imagemd.org.